Thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about a topic that's very dear and near to my heart, so it's always a pleasure to be invited to talk about something I'm passionate about. My name is Mekdelawit. I am from Ethiopia. I am doing my PhD study at Florida International University on the topic of transboundary water management, with the idea being how can we ensure equitable and sustainable use, thinking long term. And I specifically focus on the Nile Basin. And before I started my PhD, I did dabble a bit working on equitable utilization of the Nile waters. And so that's basically what I will be talking to you about today, especially linking it with the agenda of this seminar, which is energy justice. So if I could share my screen. Okay. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, it looks good.
Perfect. Okay, so my topic is going to be on equitable utilization of the Nile, from a long-term sustainability perspective. But because I don't exactly know my audience before starting the presentation, I wanted to do a bit of let's say a Nile trivia. Come on. So I'd be very happy if everybody would participate in this. I have a couple of questions, sort of like basic general questions about the Nile. So I would be very happy if everybody could participate in the chat, just to gauge where my audience is at. So how many countries do you think are in the Nile Basin? Is it 1, 3, 8, or 11? I'll be monitoring the chat, so please. 11, 8, 3, 8, 8, 8. Okay, interesting. So Nile Basin actually constitutes 11 countries, and this is one of the big misconceptions when it comes to the Nile, right? When people think of the Nile, people just think Egypt or just a handful of countries, but the Nile is as a transboundary river basin, one of the a few transboundary river basins that's shared by so many countries. Okay, next question. Come on, help me out, PowerPoint. Where do you think most of the water of the Nile comes from? Is it from Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, or others? Let's see. Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, Ethiopia. Okay. So I see a few Ethiopia, a few Uganda, few Egypt. Okay, so another misconception about the Nile is because people normally think about the Nile in relation to Egypt, so they don't exactly know where the water comes from. But before the Nile reaches Egypt, it traverses across 10 countries, and the majority of the water, actually 86% of the water, actually comes from Ethiopia, and then the rest 14% is supplemented from what we call the White Nile, which is around Lake Victoria regions, which constitute countries like Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. We will be going over it, but I just wanted to know where my audience is at. Final question. So what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about Nile? One word. Longest river, rich soil, pyramids, water, huge, water. Okay, flooding. Okay. Abundance, that's nice. Okay, Egypt, Cleopatra. Yeah, all the answers make a lot of sense. Transportation, interesting. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for indulging me. Now moving on to the presentation. So my idea when it came to this presentation was to sort of give you a bit of like a context into the Nile Basin and how it relates to this energy security or energy justice idea for the seminar, and also try and tap into this whole media hype that we hear about the Nile these days as regards to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and again, try to relate that to the energy justice idea of this seminar and what it really means for Ethiopia and the Nile Basin as a whole. So moving forward, so the Nile, geography-wise, it is the longest river in the world with approximately 6,700 kilometers. That's for more than 4,000 miles for you guys in a way that you can understand it. As we said earlier, it traverses across 11 countries before it reaches Egypt. So Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Congo, Tanzania, Rwanda, South Sudan, Sudan, and then finally both of the tributaries of the Nile merge in Sudan and then flow as one Nile or the Nile proper to Egypt. So it's not just a handful of countries, 11 countries. And within these 11 countries, 500 million people live, which are dependent on the water. On the Nile Basin along, that's the green area that you see in the map here, 260 million people, almost now close to 300 million people live directly on the Nile Basin, dependent on the water for their daily needs. And broadly, around 500 million people, 500 million people live in these 11 countries, and they are in one way or another related to the Nile water. They basically depend on for their food security, water security, energy security, and generally decent well-being on the Nile water. It's a very big basin, even though it's not a very large river. Around 3.2 million square kilometers. That's about 1.24 million square miles. So it's even though it's a small river, it does traverse a lot of area. So this is geography-wise what the Nile Basin looks like. Hydrology-wise, one of the questions I asked you where the water mostly comes from. So like I said earlier, the Nile has two major tributaries. So the bigger tributary is called the Blue Nile right here, that starts from the highlands of Ethiopia, and that constitutes 86% of the Nile water. The other 14% comes from the White Nile, so that's the longer version of the Nile. So it starts from Lake Victoria in Eastern Africa. That's shared by Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda, and then it flows all the way across South Sudan. And then the Blue Nile and the White Nile meets at the capital of Sudan in Khartoum, and then finally it flows as one Nile all the way to Egypt and then drains into the Mediterranean. So the majority of the water comes from the Blue Nile area, 86%. Sometimes in the rainy seasons, it can rise up to 90%, and the rest comes from the White Nile. And these are important numbers you'll see later on, because the disparity between where the water comes from and where the water is used is really spectacular, especially in the Nile Basin. And on the right, you see the rainfall regime in the Nile Basin. So the blue and the green are areas of high rainfall, and you can see the western part of Ethiopia, eastern part of Sudan, and then the upper riparian countries, which are the lake around the Lake Victoria region. Those are the wet parts. And as you can see, Sudan and Egypt, they are relatively really dry areas. So most of the water comes from, well, all of the water comes from these upstream riparian countries. And this is important to note. Now, the funny thing, or the curious thing about the Nile is this disparity between the endowment and the use. So as I mentioned earlier, contribution-wise, the 86% of the water comes from Ethiopia, 13% from the other eight upper riparian countries. Egypt and Sudan basically contribute 0%. But when it comes to the use of the water, 66% of the Nile water is used by Egypt, 22% is used by Sudan, 11% or 12% is allocated for evaporation losses, which basically leaves, if you add this up, that's 100% already. So basically nothing is left for Ethiopia, which constitutes the most amount of water, and also the other riparian countries. And this is basically at the root of all the controversies in the Nile. Now, this allocation has its roots in the colonial past, and we'll go over what gave rise to this this disparity, this clearly unjust status quo, but this is the current state of events. In the Nile Basin right now, all of the water is basically used by two countries, two of the most downstream countries, which are highly dependent on the Nile, no doubt. But again, the current allocation absolutely leaves no room for use by these upper riparian countries, which of course is a root of all the problems, because if any country start a development endeavor, they will be biting into the whole pie, which is already occupied or which is already accounted for by these two downstream countries, right? So you see now where the tension, where the conflict starts, right? So the water is already accounted for between two countries, but then again, there are 9 other upper riparian countries with growing economies, growing populations, climate change, pushing them to utilize their water resources, right? And so this is at the root of all the conflicts that we see in the Nile, especially also regarding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. But again, history-wise, it's not all bad. The Nile Basin is actually one of the richest places in the world as regards to civilizations. It's the cradle of mankind, right? Ancient civilizations like the Aksumite civilization from Ethiopia, the Egyptian civilization that we all know about, the pyramids, the pharaohs, the Sphinx, and also the Nubian, Meroe, and Kushite civilizations. All of these civilizations were based off of the Nile, right? Innovation-wise, the Nile River, the ebb and flow of the Nile River was responsible for the development of the first calendar. The annual Nile floods was also responsible for the flourishing of agriculture in Sudan and Egypt, which gave rise to these ancient civilizations. The Nilometer, which is basically the precursor to the current hydrology or the measurement of the Nile Dam, that also the Nile water flows, that also originated in Egypt because of the ebb and flow of the Nile River. So the Nile was basically an inspiration, a muse for innovation development. And also like it was the source of a lot of mathematical how do we say, discoveries. So the Pythagorean theorem, if you trust the legend, so the Greek mathematician, what was his name, Pythagoras, came to Egypt and saw how the shadows were working on the pyramids, and then he came up with the Pythagorean theorem, right? And also a lot of advancements in geometry, they were all made around this region. So there's a very rich history of civilization and innovation in this Nile Basin area. The people were connected throughout time, and these are ancient civilizations going back 2,000, 3,000 years in history. So, but then there was also like always the geopolitical stress or tension between the countries, right? That now has been used as a bargaining chip, but so to basically force each other's hands throughout history. So there's this story that there's this history about how Ethiopian monarchs used to threaten their Egyptian counterparts, saying, we were going to dam the Nile if you keep abusing Christians in Egypt. The Egyptian kings and queens and even the colonizers of Egypt used to pay royalty to Ethiopian monarchs back in the days to ensure the steady flow of the Nile to Egypt. So there's a very rich history around this, like a dynamics, right? So the Nile was always central in the history, social life, political lives of the people in the basin. The Nile also has a big religious and spiritual implication. So in the Christian theology, the Nile, or Abai or Gion, these are all names for the Nile, is one of the rivers that is supposed to come from Eden, right? So it's supposed to be holy water, spiritual water. There are many religious sites around the Nile in Egypt and Sudan and also in Ethiopia. And there are myths and legends that say a person who drinks from the Nile will not perish, or the water of the Nile is holy water or blessed water. So in Ethiopia, we have songs and folklores that say, Yabayoha knows Abalu, which essentially means the Nile of the water is holy, the waters of the Nile is holy water. So the Nile is basically an intricate part of the political, social, and historical lives of the people in the basin. So even though people have been quarreling about this water for ages, it's also the people in this basin are also connected by this water. So and you can see this being expressed in the motto of the Nile Basin Initiative. It says, one river, one people, one basin. So even though we have had conflicts throughout ages, there were many, many wars that were waged between Ethiopia and Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan, Sudan and Egypt, all pointing back to the control of the waters. But the Nile is also something that weaves the people in the basin together. So going back to the water use, as I mentioned earlier, this very unfair skewed water use has its roots in colonial times. So as I mentioned earlier, Sudan and Egypt, to a larger extent than Sudan, have been very dependent on the Nile waters throughout their history. And so the colonizers and the protectors of these two countries, even as early as the 19th century, as early as 1891, especially most notably the UK, wanted to ensure that the steady amount of water, the full flow of the Nile reached Egypt, right? So as early as 1891, there were agreements in the Nile Basin, sometimes between the colonial powers, mostly the UK, France, and Italy, sometimes between the UK and Egypt, sometimes just between Egypt and Sudan, which basically ensured at the bottom, at the end of the day, all of these agreements basically ensured that total flow of the Nile reached Egypt. So in 1891, for example, there was an agreement between UK and Italy, basically saying they would never touch the Nile waters consumptively in both of their spheres, and they would allow the full flow of the Nile water to reach Egypt. In 1902, there was an agreement between Ethiopia and UK, basically talking about how Ethiopia wouldn't completely block the Nile waters and would allow it to flow to Egypt. All of these agreements that you see in 1906, 1925, 1929, 1934, all of these agreements have their roots or all point to ensuring that the whole flow of the Nile reaches Egypt, right? So most notable agreements are the 1929 agreement between UK and Egypt. So a bit of history that we need to know when we talk about agreements of water use in the Nile Basin is that Egypt had a huge stake in making, the United Kingdom had a big interest in making sure the water of the Nile reached Egypt because they had huge cotton plantations in Egypt, right? So these were the drivers of the textile industries back in London. So to make sure that the textile industries did well and that the cotton plantations did not suffer, UK went to great length, as you can see in all of these agreements, to ensure that the Nile water was not consumptively used in any of these upstream countries, which, if you remember the graph earlier, they were the source of the Nile water, right? So they went to great length to ensure that all of the Nile water reached Egypt. So in 1929, when the UK wanted to expand their agricultural exploits to Sudan, they had to deal with Egypt because they needed to use some of the water for agriculture in Sudan. So they had a disagreement with Egypt because Egypt by then was a free country. They got their independence in 1922. So this 1929 agreement between UK and Egypt actually divided the Nile waters. Back then it was 48 billion cubic meters, so 52 billion cubic meters. So this 1929 agreement gave 48 billion cubic meters of water, numerically 48 billion cubic meters of water to Egypt and 4 billion cubic meters of water to Sudan, so that the UK can expand their agricultural endeavors in the Sudan. Now, following the 1929 agreement, the most notable agreement was the 1959 agreement, and this was an agreement between Sudan and Egypt, right? So the 1929 agreement did not completely utilize the Nile waters. So in 1959, Egypt and Sudan came together, and the agreement is called the agreement in the title of the agreement, it says for the full utilization of the Nile waters. So the idea was, since the 1929 agreement does not completely utilize the Nile waters, let us come up with an agreement which completely utilizes the Nile waters so we can use all of it. So the annual flow of the Nile was gauged around 84 billion cubic meters back in the day, as measured at S1. And this 1959 agreement basically allocates 55 billion cubic meters of water to Egypt, 22 billion cubic meters of water to Sudan. So a slightly bigger increment than just the 4 billion cubic meters that they got from the 1929 agreement. And then 10 billion cubic meters of water it was left for evaporation. This is essential, like if you add this up, it's 84 billion cubic meters. So this agreement fully divided the Nile waters between Egypt, Sudan, and evaporation. Again, leaving not even a drop of water for these upper riparian countries, which do have, according to international law, their fair share because they are basin countries, and by human nature, they also have a fair share, and also they need to use the waters. And so you can see, like, most of these agreements are bilateral or trilateral at best. So even though the Nile Basin has 11 countries, and that's why it's important to know how many countries the Nile traverses, many of these agreements are bilateral or trilateral, and many of these agreements do have their roots in the colonial times, right? So when most of the Nile Basin countries came out of colonialism and they had their independence, they rebelled against these agreements, right? Because one, they were not party to the agreements. Ethiopia was never colonized, so Ethiopia has been throughout the age constantly protesting that these agreements are not inclusive and Ethiopia is not bound by what these agreements dictate. But the facts on the ground was that the water was completely used by these two downstream countries, and all of these upstream riparian countries, which happened to be the sources of the water, were disenfranchised and didn't have any legal share according to these agreements. So as you can imagine, these agreements, all of them were very uninclusive, they're very unfair, and obviously inequitable. And sometimes they even infringed on the national sovereignty of countries. For example, if you saw the agreement between Egypt and UK, which was back then a colonial master in Uganda, this agreement talks about a dam that was being built in Uganda. And so imagine signing an agreement about a dam in Uganda that is being built in Uganda between Egypt and UK, right? So Uganda was under the colonial rule of the UK, so basically they had no sovereignty and no power. And basically this agreement between Egypt and UK talks about how Egypt would have basically their hands on the tap, and an Egyptian engineer would basically tell the Ugandan engineers who are operating the dam how much to let go, when to let go, everything. So this agreement basically infringes on the sovereignty of Uganda, which is sort of the type of request that we are seeing now when it comes to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, these agreements might have been acceptable back then because, again, Uganda was under colonial rule of the UK. But you can imagine, once these countries got their freedoms back, they did not want to be bound by these agreements. One, because they were not inclusive, and two, because they were unfair and they did infringe on national sovereignty. And also, especially in the context of now, these agreements are very unsustainable. The way water is used right now in Sudan and Egypt is not efficient, it's very wasteful, and it's not sustainable, considering climate change, considering increasing demand, and considering economic growth. It's not going to cut it. The way we're using water right now is not going to be sustainable or enough in the long term. So these were the 1929 and the 1959 agreements. They were the most important agreements to take note of, because these were the two agreements that quantitatively divided the waters between these two downstream countries. And so we come back to this agreement, the disparity between the endowments, where the water comes from, and where it is being used. And this is the core of all the controversy in the Nile Basin. So putting this aside for a bit, let's just see what the current state of events is in the Nile Basin right now. So the United Nations has set its sustainable development goals, right? I'm pretty sure everybody knows about them. These are 17 goals that the world is supposed to reach at by 2030. So those include food security, water security, energy security, education access to all, a dignified life, industries. We'll get back to them. But current state of events as it relates to basic human needs, that is food security, water security, sanitation, access, and energy security in the Nile in the Nile Basin is nowhere near full or complete. Looking at food security, you can see that almost all of the Nile Basin countries have some level of food insecurity, anywhere ranging from serious food insecurity to moderate food insecurity, right? And there's no exception. Looking at energy security, again, with the big exception of Egypt, which has almost 100% access to electricity, both in rural and urban areas, all of the Nile Basin countries have very, very low energy access to their population. I can tell you about Ethiopia. Ethiopia currently, the electricity coverage in Ethiopia right now is 48%. The population in Ethiopia is around 115 million. That means more than half, 65 million people still don't have access to energy, right? Access to clean energy. Looking at water security and sanitation, again, with the clear exception of Egypt, most of the Nile Basin countries have really low water access, water security access, and also the sanitation is even worse. Poverty line, again, with the exception of Egypt, a big percentage of the population and all of the Nile Basin countries is living below the poverty line. Human Development Index, looking at by any measure, the Nile Basin is really nowhere near fulfilling any of these SDG goals. So there's still a long way to go in terms of fulfilling very basic human need, right? Food access, food security, energy security, water security, access to sanitation. And by proxy, because I don't need to tell you these because you're all energy students, but access to clean energy is the roots, is basically what triggers access to education, access to healthcare, access to industries, by proxy, creation of jobs, creation of a clean environment, everything. Access to clean energy is behind everything that triggers all of these sustainable development goals. So we have a long way to go in terms of sustaining very basic human needs, but then we only have a limited amount of water. And there's also this roadblock, which is the doctrinal difference between the countries, right? Looking at the future demand. So this is where we are now. Looking at the future demand, population is rising everywhere. This is not just in the Nile Basin, but you can see from the graph, it's rising very steeply, right? And there's no exception here. This is happening everywhere. Population is rising very steeply in all of the Nile Basin countries. And with population demand comes an increase in water demand as well, right? A growing population needs more water, more food, more energy, and that translates to more water demand. So looking at the future forecast of water need in the Nile Basin, currently, for example, municipal water demand is around 4 billion cubic meters, but that's going to rise to 11 billion cubic meters. Industrial water demand is not so much right now. It's about 1 billion cubic meters, but that's going to increase to 2.8, close to 3 billion cubic meters. And by far the largest water user, the irrigation water demand, right now it's about 82.2 billion cubic meters, but we're going to need around 138 billion cubic meters by 2050. Notice the flow of the Nile, the annual discharge of the Nile is 84 billion cubic meters. Some research puts it at, like, let's say 100 billion cubic meters. Very, very optimistic estimate. That's nowhere near our future irrigation demand. That's our irrigation demand, let alone our other demands. Because irrigation is by far the highest water user, let's zoom into the actual irrigation and the forecasted irrigation demand between countries. So right now, because the water is accounted for, the water use in the Nile Basin is accounted for by two countries. The largest water users are Egypt. They require around 66.4 billion cubic meters of water, and Sudan, around 14 billion cubic meters of water. In the future, Egypt alone is going to need 80 billion cubic meters of water just for irrigation. Sudan is going to need around 26 billion cubic meters of water just for irrigation. And there's going to be other players. Ethiopia right now uses 2 billion cubic meters, which is basically nothing, but we're going to need around 23 billion cubic meters by 2050, right? So just looking at the irrigation water demand, 138 billion cubic meters, this is nowhere close to the capacity of the Nile. So what do you do? And this is the problem. How do you ensure equitable, sustainable use of the Nile water, making sure that everybody has their fair share? But how do you sustain a growing demand with a very fixed need, right? Not to mention, on top of that, there's always climate change everywhere. We do have a limited amount of water, let's say optimistic estimates 100 billion cubic meters, but then there's climate change. Lucky for the Nile Basin, climate change is expected to increase rainfall in the Nile Basin by anywhere between 5 to 10%, but that's nowhere close to how steep the demand is increasing, right? And so that brings us to the next question. So how do we ensure growing needs with limited amounts? And not to mention, we have these roadblocks, these conceptual differences between the countries in the basin because of the uneven water divide that's currently there. So now it's the right time to talk about these two concepts that are very prevalent in the Nile Basin: water security versus securitization of water. Now, for a person who's not really into this topic, these two might look the same. Sometimes people use them interchangeably, but they should not be used interchangeably. Now, the UN defines water security as the capacity of a population to safeguard access to adequate quantity and acceptable quality of water for sustaining livelihood, right? For food, for water, for sanitation, for socioeconomic development, for protection of the environment, for protection against waterborne pollution and water-related disasters, and also for preserving the ecosystem, right? So water security deals with how much water does every citizen, every country need to sustain basic benefits, right? That this is a sane definition. On the other hand, we have securitization of water. This is a social construct, a political construct more like, and it makes water into an existential problem. It's like a military commodity, and then water, instead of it being a human commodity, a human right, let's say, it is dehumanized, made into a military commodity, which should be claimed, owned, and defended at all costs, right? So access to water essentially becomes equated with national security. And it's a very extreme version that thinks that enables it. So embracing the securitization of enables enables countries to use whatever means necessary in the name of water security. Issues become securitized, even though they don't necessarily represent existential problems to a country, but rather they represent issues where someone was successful in constructing an issue into an existential problems. This was a definition from a paper that was published in 1998, so it was way back. This is not a new construct. But securitization of water, it makes it into a military commodity instead of a human need, a human demand, right? Whereas water security, that's a definition which can bring countries together, because every country wants to secure the basic needs, that is food, energy, sanitation, access to all of their citizens. So the idea of ensuring water security for everyone, that can bring people together. But securitizing water, it has this sense of entitlement and ownership, right? And this is what we're dealing with in the Nile Basin. If you've heard or if you've read any of these narratives around the Nile, there is this word: the Nile is existential to Egypt, right? This is what you already hear. But I hope I've tried to show you that because the human needs are nowhere near to being met, the Nile is existential to all the countries in the basin, because the utilization of this Nile water is important, is paramount to ensure water security, food security, energy security, sanitation, and all the ripple effects that come with it, like access to healthcare, access to education, access to jobs, the flourishing of industries, the protection of the climate and the environment, everything. So the Nile is not just essential or existential to Egypt, but to all of the Nile Basin countries. But the current doctrine, the dominant doctrine in the Nile Basin, especially in Egypt and the world at large, because the narrative is already formed, is that the Nile equals Egypt. If you touch the Nile, you touch Egypt, Egypt's national security. So this idea of the securitization of water is very dominant. So when you talk about equitable use, it's this doctrinal tension that you also have to deal with, right? Because you have to, even though I don't need to convince anyone that the water is essential for Ethiopia, I basically have to, right? So how do you, again, so the big question becomes, how do we ensure equitable utilization? How do we ensure equitable share for all countries in the basin? And how do we ensure that the limited amount of water in the Nile can be enough to satisfy the growing needs, the growing food need, the growing water need, and the growing energy needs. So we have to deal with rising demand, like we saw earlier, that come from increasing population, increasing economic growth, and better quality of life everywhere. But we also have just limited amount of water. And there's this doctrinal problem that we have to deal with. There's a historical baggage, right? All of these colonial treaties, they have left a big trauma in the basin, right? So these upper riparian countries that were under colonial rule feel like they've been disenfranchised by the colonizers, right? Egypt and Sudan, they call it historical rights. They say they have, because they have been using the water exclusively in the past, they are entitled to the full share of the water. And they call this historical rights to the water. Ethiopia, even though it was independent, an independent country was not under colonial rule, Ethiopia has not been allowed to use the water, or has not been able to use the water because of these geopolitical pressures from everywhere, right? We have been to so many wars, just 16 or 17 wars in the 18th century between Ethiopia and Egypt have happened, all with the roots being traced back to the Nile, right? So there's this very big trauma, historical baggage that has to do with the Nile water. But then also there's this connectivity, a sense of brotherhood, because the people in the Nile Basin, they're basically brothers, because throughout the centuries, millennia, basically 3,000 years of history, these people have interbred, like they're one, basically. They're already tied by the river as well. So there's this very dichotomous pull and push in the basin that we have to deal with, and not to mention, and then there's always the international geopolitical pressures, right? So Egypt is a very strategic, where Egypt is placed, and in general, the northeastern part of Africa, including Horn of Africa, is a very strategic position. So regardless of the water, the relationship that big countries, especially countries like Egypt and Ethiopia, have with major players, highly influence the water use. So the big question is, with all of these things in the play, how do we ensure equitable and sustainable use, especially considering the long-term water use into play? And this is basically what I try to deal with. So let's scope it down to Ethiopia, and then we'll come to the hot mess that's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. I already mentioned that Ethiopia contributes 86% of the Nile water, but what does that mean for Ethiopia? So the Nile in Ethiopia, it's called Abai. So that constitutes 70% of Ethiopia's surface water resource, right? So the Nile itself is already a big chunk of the resource in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has only a few resources. It has a very big land, a very big population, and lots of water. So from the surface water that Ethiopia has, 70% of it flows to the Nile. So that's how Ethiopia contributes 86% to the Nile, right? So assume if you had a salary and 70% of your salary went to something, right? Like to some kind of expense, you would be really interested to know how that expense or where that money was going, right? So the Nile is like that for Ethiopia. It accounts for 70% of the surface water flow in Ethiopia, and that's a big amount. The thing is, so Ethiopia has 12 major river basins, and all the big ones that you see here, they all flow to the Nile. Not just that, so Abai, that constitutes 55 billion cubic meters. That's already more than half of the Nile flow alone. The Barwa Kobo River around 23 billion cubic meters. Marab, 0.72, this is a very dry river. And then Tekeze, 8.2. When you add these up, that constitutes 86% of the Nile water, but also 70% of Ethiopia's water resource. But it's not just the Nile that flows out of Ethiopia. Look at this map here. On the right, you see the rivers of Ethiopia. The interesting thing here is, with the exception of one river, which is the Awash River in the central part of Ethiopia, all of the rivers of Ethiopia are flowing outside the country, right? The map on the left side shows you the degree, the level of dependence of countries for their water use on their neighboring countries. So it's only Ethiopia and Lesotho down here that you see in black. So Lesotho is a very water-rich country that is like in the middle of South Africa. It's not dependent for its water on South Africa, but South Africa is dependent on it. The same story for Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not dependent for its water on any of these neighboring countries, which is why it's called the water tower of East Africa or Africa. But all of our neighboring countries, all of our neighbors are dependent for water on us, on Ethiopia, right? Because all of the rivers are transboundary. Now, this might seem like a good thing, right? A good thing on first glance, but for Ethiopia, it has been a curse, because what that means is, because these other countries are dependent on the water flowing from Ethiopia, any kind of development endeavor is going to raise some kind of chaos, right? Whether it be consumptive or non-consumptive. And now into one more thing that we have to mention is all of the rivers in Ethiopia are very, very seasonal. There is no single river in Ethiopia that's constantly flowing throughout the year, because the rain in Ethiopia is very seasonal, and it's the rain that feeds these rivers. The rivers in Ethiopia only flow from June, July to September, October. So that's a span of 3 or 4 months, right? So as you can see, we have very low flows, and then all of a sudden it spikes in the rainy season. This is the trend for all of the rivers in Ethiopia. What this means is then storage dams, some kind of infrastructure that is meant to hold the water that comes, to hold this huge amount of water that comes during the rainy season, hold it and use it throughout the year, is necessary, which necessitates building of storage dams in Ethiopia. And it's under this context now that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam comes into play, right? All of the water is transboundary. Water is one of the largest resources that the country has, and it only comes in a matter of 3 or 4 months. So it's a must that Ethiopia and also these upper riparian countries, which sort of have the same kind of hydrology and weather conditions or climate conditions like Ethiopia, it's necessary for these countries to build dams, hold the water, and find a mechanism to use it in the long term, over the whole season, over the whole year, right? Now, in comes the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So again, just to reiterate, the Nile for Ethiopia, it accounts for 70% of the water resource, but also potential-wise, right? Ethiopia, this area that is encircled in black, that's the Nile Basin in Ethiopia, part of the Nile Basin in Ethiopia. This accounts for 1/3 of the country, right? So a third, and Ethiopia is a big country, or almost like 1.1 million square kilometers. A third of the country lies in that basin. 2/3 of the irrigation potential of the country is also in the Nile Basin. That's around almost 2.4 million hectares, right? And so without developing these areas, there's no way Ethiopia can ensure food security. Moreover, 2/3 of the hydropower potential in Ethiopia is also in this basin. And Ethiopia has immense hydropower potential. It's estimated to be around 45,000 megawatts of energy, right? Out of this, 30,000 megawatts of potential is found in the Nile Basin. So for Ethiopia, it's not a matter of choice, like whether or not to develop this basin. If we are to ensure food security, if we are to ensure water security, if we are to ensure energy security, it's absolutely a must that Ethiopia must develop this region, because the majority of the resources are accumulated there. So with this in mind, and we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, with this in mind, and now we can talk about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So for context, the current electricity production in Ethiopia is about 4,800 megawatts. And I already told you the potential of Ethiopia to produce hydropower is about 45,000 megawatts. So not even 1/10 of that potential is utilized, right? So with that in place, in comes the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's a massive hydropower dam that is built on the Blue Nile. That's the big tributary for the Nile. And the construction started in 2011, so it's been quite some time, more than 10 years now. It's expected to produce more than 5,000 megawatts of energy. So it's going to double the energy capacity in Ethiopia, and that's going to have ripple effects. Because nobody touches projects on the Nile Basin, again, because of political issues with Egypt, it is self-financed. None of these big donors are financing it. It is self-financed by the people of Ethiopia, and right now it's about 80% complete, with the first and second year filling already happening in 2020 and 2021, and obviously, as you can imagine, it has been a cause of bitter conflict between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. Again, you can understand with world politics being what it was in the past few years, between the dynamics of Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, with the basin not having a decent framework for water use, building a huge dam on a major tributary, on the biggest tributary in the Nile, has been a source of major concern. But you can't deny then the value that this dam brings to Ethiopia. As I mentioned already, now even the current existing power of Ethiopia is not even close to the expected production of the Nile of the GERD, right? 5,000 megawatts. It's going to double the energy capacity in Ethiopia. Now, the GERD, I mean, this presentation is not about the GERD, but the GERD, even though it's a dam that's being built in Ethiopia, obviously it is massive energy. It's going to double the production capacity of the country. It's going to bring foreign currency to Ethiopia because excess energy is supposed to be exported, and it actually changes the power dynamics in the basin, the status quo in the basin. But it also has a lot of benefit to Egypt and Sudan. It reduces sedimentation by around 86%. It's going to regulate the flow of the Nile. So that seasonality, that up and down in the Nile, is going to be reduced. So there's more opportunity to increase irrigated agriculture. Especially Sudanese dams are going to have the opportunity to increase their energy production capacity without having any structural changes. It's a buffer to environmental extremes, whether it's flooding or droughts, both of which are prevalent in the Nile Basin. And it is going to increase the renewable energy stock in the Eastern African power pool, right? So with the fight against climate change and everything, it's going to have significant implications. But the major problem here is, like we said, it's going to change the status quo, right? It's going to give Ethiopia a better hand at controlling that now. And this is in stark opposition or in stark conflict to how things were in the past, right? So the 1959 agreement, that agreement that allocates the whole of the Nile waters between Sudan and Egypt, assumes that these upper riparian countries use nothing, right? And even though the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is just a hydropower project and it's not consumptive, it holds a large amount of water in its reservoir. And the fear is that, what if Ethiopia starts using the water consumptively? What if Ethiopia just turns off the water, even though that's not a possibility, right? So there's this big shake of the status quo, which obviously the current dominant users, Egypt and Sudan, are not in favor of. So in my opinion, the underlying reason for all this tension in the Nile Basin is the change in status quo in the Nile water use. Now, this is just the highlights, because the dam is being built now. There's discussions and negotiations about the filling and operation of the dam. But the root of the problem in the Nile Basin is this current status quo. And with that, with all of this in place, again, we come to that big question again. How do we ensure equitable and sustainable use in the Nile Basin while we have these rising demands, limited water, doctrinal problems, historical baggage, and geopolitical pressure? So obviously, because the allocation in the Nile Basin is not equitable, So one of the first recommendations is that, yeah, we need a reallocation of the Nile water. And that was one of the first research routes that I took, right? So how would an equitable allocation in the Nile look like? So in a previous study that I did, and this was actually published in 2021, we tried to, so the international law has basic frameworks, let's say, legal frameworks, which sort of tell you what to consider when you're considering equitable allocation. So we have three main principles in international law. There's the principle of equitable use, equitable and reasonable use, the principle to cause no significant harm, and the duty to cooperate. And they actually highlight the UN Convention, the United Nations Convention for the Management of Transboundary Waters actually lists a set of factors to consider in the determination of equitable and reasonable use. So we took those factors and we tried to give them different weights and tried to see under multiple scenarios, what would the water share between all of these countries be? And this is sort of basically a summary of that result. But the graph is not the important thing. I'll summarize the conclusions for you. So the first conclusion is that under no type of equitable allocation would Egypt get 66% and Sudan get 22%. So under any type of equitable allocation, Egypt and Sudan are going to get less, especially Egypt is going to get less than what it's used to right now, right? And we already saw earlier that even the whole of the Nile water, even if the whole of the Nile water was left for Egypt, it wouldn't be sufficient to fulfill their needs by 2050, right? Because irrigation alone would need 80 billion cubic meters. So that was the first conclusion. Under no type of equitable allocation is the current status quo just, and no type of allocation is going to give Egypt the amount of water that it is using now, because the other countries would also get a fair share, right? The current dominant users of the water will get lower shares under equitable allocation. That was the second conclusion. And so if, like, thinking academically, right, not putting the nationalistic hats, but thinking academically and humanly, right? If we need to secure food security, water security, basic human needs for all of these Nile Basin countries, water allocation cannot be the end. We cannot stop at physical water allocation between the countries because it's not going to cut it. If we give Ethiopia 30 billion cubic meters, Sudan this amount, Egypt that amount, that minuscule amount of water is not going to be able to ensure basic human needs in any of these countries, right? So what was very clear to me after I did this research was that, okay, there is a very big need to go beyond water allocation and engage in some type of integrated water use so that we can capitalize on the resources of the basin and we can make the best of the water to ensure that we get maximum benefit and also ensure the needs of people, not just in Egypt and Sudan, but also in all these Nile Basin riparian countries. So I came up with a few recommendations, which I'm trying to operationalize in my PhD. But so, in my opinion, and I'm a strong believer of this hypothesis, so much so that I'm basing my PhD off of it, basin-wide thinking is the way forward. That's me. This is what I'm trying to prove in my PhD as well. So considering the basin as an economic unit, right? And capitalizing on the resources of the basin. There's 50 million hectares of fertile land in the Nile Basin that can be used to grow the food in the basin. Ethiopia, I told you, Ethiopia alone has 45,000 megawatts of potential of producing clean energy. That's more than enough for the Nile Basin countries, right? There's this huge technological advantage that Egypt has, which can foster innovation. We can think about physical water trade, virtual water trade, increasing water use efficiency in the basin, because right now irrigation efficiency in Sudan and Egypt is really, really low, and the practices right now over there are very wasteful. Using water smart investments, capitalizing on location efficiency, right? You don't need to build your dam where it's not efficient to have it. Build it in the upstream riparian countries where evaporation is low and the topography allows you to maximize the to maximize production. Sudan has a lot of fertile land. We don't necessarily need to grow our oranges or whatever in the desert where it's going to need more water, right? So capitalize on location efficiency. But again, this needs regional integration. It needs synchronized planning and operation. We can also talk about co-owned infrastructures. We have a lot of very exemplary practices. Even in Africa, in the Senegal River Basin, there's a shared dam that was built that's co-owned by three countries, Senegal, Guinea, and Mali, in the Senegal River Basin, and they use it together. It accounts for their hydropower need, it accounts for their navigation need and irrigation need. So there are many examples across the world that we can take. And we can think about exploring alternative water uses, because the Nile alone, we saw it's not going to be enough, right? So there's groundwater to consider, rainwater harvesting, wastewater treatment, and finally, environmental conservation and creating water conscious citizens. So these were the conclusions or the recommendations I came up with during my master thesis. So, but making sure that these recommendations work in the basin is under question mark, because, and rather, but, and this is a very big but, right? Okay, we have already talked about this. There needs to be a very significant paradigm shift in the basin, right? Rather than thinking about owning the water or the sense of entitlement, we need to shift from securitization and entitlement to equitable use, to actually recognizing, acknowledging the water belongs to not just one, not just two, not just 3 countries, but 11 countries. There needs to be a reckoning in the Nile Basin, an acknowledgement of equal rights, an acknowledgement of past injustices, and especially a very, very big goodwill and empathy and understanding from the side of the current dominant users, right? And any endeavors going forward needs to be rooted in the firm understanding of equitable share of all countries. Right now, even in negotiations at high level, you hear negotiators or political leaders from Sudan and Egypt talking about their historical share or ensuring that the share of Egypt does not go down, right? All of this conversation points to the 1959 agreement, which gives the water just to 2 countries and disenfranchises the other countries, right? So even our vocabulary needs to change, our thinking, our paradigm, everything needs to change, and we need to go beyond the current water entitlement. And this is a big ask. If you ask an Ethiopian, they don't want to share the water because they feel they've been historically disenfranchised, right? So it's like hurt people. They want to be like, you don't blame them if they want to abuse the power for now. But if we want to ensure a sustainable future in the basin for everybody, allocation is not the end, and a basin-wide thinking is necessary. But for that to happen, there needs to be a big shift. And Professor Aaron Wolf in Oregon University, from Oregon State University, has a brilliant framework on how to manage such kind of differences, right? He calls it the 4 Welts framework. This is actually a negotiation framework, but he says water is not just physical, right? When we manage water, we're not just talking about managing the physical water. It's not about the amount, the quantity of water, but we need to think about the mental water. That's efficiency. How can we maximize the use and stuff? So mostly when people talk about water management, it's either the physical or the mental, but there's also the emotional water, right? How people are connected to the Nile. I've been to Sudan. I have many friends from Egypt, and the way they talk about the Nile is heartbreaking. How connected they are to the Nile, how they revere and love the Nile. I have sympathy for that, right? So we also need to consider how people feel about the Nile, their relationship to the Nile. We have to manage the emotional water. This includes the history, the injustice, the trauma, the power dynamics, the colonialism that happened, and all the rubbish that it has left in the basin, right? So we also need to manage that. And finally, there's the spiritual aspect of it, right? The Nile is not an inanimate thing in the Nile Basin. It's highly revered. It's like really, it's really tied to the to the social psyche. Like I did another study about how the Nile is portrayed in the artistic narrative of people in the Nile Basin, and it's amazing. Every song, every folklore, every poem has the Nile in it, and the kind of emotions that are displayed shows you how deeply intricate, how deeply involved the Nile is in the lives of people. So we need to manage not just the physical and the mental, but also the emotional and the spiritual aspects of the water. And we need a very big paradigm shift in the Nile Basin. And this works. This is not just hypothetical. And I'll give you a very good example. You know, the situation between Israel and Palestine, these two countries are basically at odds in everything, but they do share the Jordan River and the Jordan River Basin. And when they came together to negotiate about the how to use the Jordan River Basin, Israel was very intent on maximizing the benefits and allocation, while Palestine wanted an acknowledgement of their fair share. Sort of like there is the kind of, and this is what we see in the Nile Basin as well. Ethiopia and all the other upstream Nile riparian countries want an acknowledgement of their basic rights, right? So what the negotiators came up with was a new word. They call it rightful allocation, right? So it's not very fancy, but rightful allocation ticks off the allocation part for Israel and also ensures that the rights of Palestine are acknowledged, right? Rightful allocation. And they came up with a brilliant plan to maximize the benefit of the water in the Jordan Basin, in a basin that is basically at odds about everything, even the existence of one country, the existence of the other country, right? So there's hope if we have a holistic look at the water, and if we go beyond this nationalistic myopic view and start thinking about the basin as a whole and how to maximize the water use of the basin, to ensure that we have basic decent human life, right? So again, I always go back to the Sustainable Development Goals because it puts things in perspective, not just for the Nile Basin people, but people of the world, right? So no poverty, zero hunger, good health, education, all of these things are driven by energy security. And energy security in the Nile Basin means equity and justice, right? There needs to be an acknowledgement. We can't just move forward, but there needs to be a reckoning, an acknowledgement of the past injustices, an acknowledgement of rights and benefits of the upper riparian countries, and then finally an acknowledgement that this physical allocation is not the end and we need to think holistically. Thank you so much. I feel like I've talked for hours. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer, but thank you so much for allowing me to vent and also to share my research and my vision with you. Yeah, I think this is the last slide. Yes.
Wow, I think I can speak for all of us saying thank you, and really great and informative and passionate presentation. I'm sure that I have lots of questions, but I'll open it up to the audience. Just go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we'll continue this conversation.
Yeah, I definitely second Jessica's sentiments. This amazing presentation. It was very, very informative, and I think you did an amazing job for sure. I do want to keep us on track with time. So if you do have any questions, I'd like to open the space, but I do want us to be mindful of the time. So let's try to get first come, first serve. And then if there's anything that runs over, we can definitely take those questions offline and continue that conversation, because I'm sure there are a lot of really impactful conversations that can come out of this. So let's try to keep that in mind. And again, feel free to ask in the chat or by raising your hand and whatnot.
I see one question in the chat. Samanvita Murthy asks, has this issue been picked up by African Union? Yes, it has been. Lately, the negotiations on the dam has been happening under the auspices, under the guidance of the African Union. But things haven't been really favorable to continue negotiations because of the internal struggles in Ethiopia, and then later on, most recently in Sudan. So the negotiations around the Nile water and the GERD have sort of been silent for a while, but yes, African Union, short answer, yes, the AU has picked up this issue. Of course, it's a big deal for these three countries. for all the 11 countries.
Christy, I see your hands raised. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to say thank you. So I have a couple questions. I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask two. So the first is, I'm really interested in for us, by us energy systems. So I think it's really admirable that Ethiopians were able to raise the money themselves for GERD. Can you speak a little bit about those efforts and how that actually happened?
Yeah, I can tell you a very personal story. So I was a second-year bachelor student when the GERD was first announced. I think I was like, what, 19? And it was a huge deal when it was announced in Ethiopia. You know that like we know, like there have been a lot of efforts in the past to try and build this dam. So it's not a plan that just popped up in the last year or something. It's a generational dream. This dam we've been trying to build this dam since the 1960s, from the time of Emperor Haile Selassie, all through the Derg regime, and then finally it's here. So there was such a big motivation in everybody, and people were very very patriotic in a sense, right? So everybody bought bonds from for the dam. So that's how we were able to finance the project. And we were students, we didn't have a lot of money, but we gave our so they used to give us this allowance, monthly allowance, because we were students back then. And I think we gave 1 month or our 1 month or 2 month allowance for the dam, and we basically bought bonds. I mean, that's like pennies when it went, because this is like a 5 billion USD project, but that's how much we were fascinated and like enthusiastic about it. People give donations. There was even this because Ethiopia has a big Muslim population, and Muslims don't like taking interest. People were talking about how can we give money and not get interest, right? So it doesn't clash with religious sentiments and whatnot. So people were very enthusiastic. People still are very enthusiastic, and not just people in Ethiopia, but there are diaspora everywhere, especially in the US and Europe. I was also part of a lot of fundraising events for the dam, and in one sitting we raised 50,000-60,000 US dollars. So this really is a project that's in the hearts and minds of people. There's a big following about the GERD on Twitter and on Facebook. People talk about it. People really, this idea of equitable and reasonable utilization, even though it's a very academic topic, it's now in the everyday conversation. It's in the everyday vocabulary of normal people, and that's how you know people are really engaged in this. And I think that's a very big opportunity for the Nile Basin. So you know how they say, don't let a crisis go to waste. So there's a very big momentum in the Nile Basin, like never before. So I really do think we need to capitalize on this momentum and try and push change, to push this notion of equitable and reasonable utilization and get the ball rolling, because this is such a big moment. And it's not just in Ethiopia, even though it's on the flip side, people are also talking about this in Sudan, and people are also talking about this in Egypt, right? And Ethiopia, 100 million people, Egypt, more than 100 million people, right? So there's this big conversation happening, and for different reasons in different countries. But again, it has been a big issue for the past 10 plus years. And in Ethiopia, it's a source of big pride. It's basically a project that's like redeeming, and even from the name, right? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Ethiopia used to be a great country in history, but lately we've been known for famine and war and civil war. So that there's this deep sense of vindication, right? We're taking our dignity back, we're taking our renaissance back, we're taking our future back. So it really resonates in the hearts and minds of people, and people are giving from what little they have. I mean, it's not a rich country, so when people give their salaries, their allowances, they buy bonds here and there without this expectation of any return, it's just heartening, very heartening. Thank you, Christy, for mentioning this. I didn't want to raise it because, yeah, this is an academic thing, but yeah.
No, of course, I definitely think it's the space for it. And then my other question is that there are a number of countries in the Nile Basin that have dams prior to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam being built. This is even outside of Sudan and Egypt. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to why maybe it hasn't been as much controversy as there has been with Ethiopia, and even if you think that there might be colonial ties to that.
Yeah, absolutely. There are 25 dams just built on the Nile, and the GERD is definitely not the first. There's the highest one dam in Egypt, the Meru Dam, the Sinai Dam, even though there are a lot smaller dams compared to the GERD, and also in the upper riparian countries. There's one in Uganda that we talked about earlier when we were talking about the agreements. The thing with the GERD is that, one, the size of it, right? It's a massive dam. It's going to hold 1.5 times the flow of the Nile, right? I mean, that's not so drastic in itself, because the highest one dam in Egypt can hold almost 3 years flow of the Nile, right? So size-wise, the Aswan High Dam is actually bigger than the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. But the location of it and the position of Ethiopia, right? So the dam, the GERD is built on the Blue Nile, which is the major tributary of the Nile, right? So that would obviously create a lot more fear and a lot more unease on the side of Egyptians and Sudan. So that has to do a lot with it. And it's also because it's a turning point, right? So like I said, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam did not just pop out of nowhere. There was the cooperative framework agreement that was it's an agreement that was negotiated by these Nile Basin countries for 10 years. For the first time in our history, not just one, not just two, not just three, but all basin countries were negotiating on how to use the waters based on equitable and reasonable use. And we've been negotiating that for 10 years. And in 2010, we basically agreed on a draft framework, but Sudan and Egypt would not sign it after negotiating on it for 10 years, because they wanted an assurance of, they wanted to preserve basically the historical rights agenda in the cooperative framework agreement, which of course was a no-go for the upper riparian countries. So it's after that whole 10-year negotiation fell that, okay, the government was fed up and like, okay, so negotiation is not working, and so we're going to do this unilaterally. When the GERD was actually originally planned, it was planned as part of a joint project. It was called the Border Dam, and it was supposed to be developed by Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt together. That's also why the position is really close to the border of Sudan, right? So it's a dam that was born out of frustration. It's a dam that was the culmination of so much effort, so much trial. So I guess that it also signals a change in momentum, right? A change in how things work. So all of this accounts for why people are nervous on the other end.
Thank you again.
I did have one question, hopefully not to take any time from our guest, but I did want to know, so it seems like the concept of co-ownership was exclusive of a lot of external pressures, especially like, so just say partnerships or just external pressures in general, and try to basically focus more on all of the basin countries in general, like the countries that actually are using the Nile or will be affected by this. And I'm wondering if that is a realistic consideration, considering, like people have different partnerships and things of that nature in this mostly ideal, right, situation, because there are some people that are benefiting obviously inequitably. So in this negotiation or this concept of development of co-ownership, is there some inherent consideration of the external pressures and partnerships like nationally that may affect how these negotiations go about?
Absolutely. I'll admit this, my recommendations are very far-fetched, especially considering how the situation in the Nile Basin is now, right? But as I have my academic hat on, I have to think about the future and try and see what's going to work. But absolutely, given how conditions are in the Nile Basin now, co-ownership is a very far-fetched idea, because we don't have the favorable ground in the first place, an acknowledgement of rights and benefits in the first place, to even start to talk about co-owned infrastructures, right? For example, if take the Senegal River Basin, the basin that I mentioned as an exemplary practice, right? It's a basin of 4 countries, so that the number also helps, right? These 4 basin countries were all French colonies, and after they had their independence in the 70s, in the 1970s, they had this huge drought which devoured the countries, right? So when they came out of it, they had this understanding, because they had the shared history. They had this understanding that, yeah, we need to use this water, so we don't have that kind of droughts in the future, right? So there wasn't this very big discrepancy or disparity in the power dynamics and the water use and everything in the Senegal River Basin. So the ground was very favorable, and it was even funded by one of these big financial World Bank, if I'm not mistaken, World Bank, right? So that was a lot easier. When it comes to the Nile, there are a lot of things to do on the ground in the first place, which is why I really try to stress on the paradigm shift and this acknowledgement of rights and benefits before we engage on these co-owned infrastructures and thinking of the basin as a whole. There needs to be a reckoning first, which is also why the reallocation of water, even though it's not an end in its own, at least it tells each country and the international population, the international community, what every country is owed, right? What every country is entitled to. And then from that place of equity, I should say, from that place of equity, and from understanding that equity is not going to sustain us in the long term, then we can embark on these basin-wide thinking. So I am not under any illusion that these co-owned infrastructures or shared benefits sharing schemes would be applicable in the Nile Basin right now or in the near future, because there's a lot of groundwork to do in the first place. So absolutely, a great point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. I received a question in the chat I can read to you. This is from Jean. I think she had to leave early. She said, it's regarding the table you presented on the future demand of water across the 11 countries that rely on the Nile River. I'm curious as to the uses that were considered in this demand projection. Also, I'm curious about why some countries have dramatically large increases of demand while some have more moderate increases.
So the demands were based off of 3 major uses: irrigation, municipal water use, and industrial water use. And the projections, there were they considered 2 scenarios: a high water use scenario and a medium water use scenario, considering what the plans of each country are for 2030 and 2050, what the projected economic growth, projected population growth are for each country. And then based off of those, the estimated water need was calculated. So it was based on the irrigation, domestic water use, and municipal water use, and industrial water use off of the countries. And the increase in water demand between countries really depends on how fast the economies and how fast the population in each country is growing. So for example, Ethiopia, population is really increasing. The energy demand in Ethiopia, for example, increases 19% every year, right? So you can imagine the demand in Ethiopia is steeply rising. Maybe that's not the case in, let's say, I don't know, Rwanda, who has a smaller population to begin with, but also maybe they have a more or less stable, a slower growth of things, right? So the increase in demand really depends on how, in the trajectories of the countries. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sure Jean will see the recording of that one. That's what she wanted. Any more questions from the participants? You can go ahead and raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat. I have one question. I was just wondering, so the GERD isn't finished yet. Is there, do you know, or is there an estimate of when it will be done?
Yeah, so right now it's more than 80% finished. A lot of the civil work is almost done, electromechanical, the fitting of the turbines and the fitting of the power station, that's also going on. So it's actually expected to start first power production in a few months. So that's exciting for Ethiopians, but the project is supposed to be completed in, I think, 2 years. So it would be 2023. well, yeah, 2023 is the estimated completion of the whole project, and it has been delayed many years, so it's a long time coming. Yeah,
That's great. As all big projects are always delayed.
that's true. Yeah.
Great. Well, if anyone has any questions, definitely raise your hand or put it in the chat. But I just want to thank you so much for coming and giving us such a great presentation. And I really, appreciate how you started it, during the colonial times and talking about like the impact of colonization on the idea of the Nile and the use of the water and the impact that has on what's happening today, and also kind of, giving hope to the situation. So that was really great. For everybody that's here, this will be posted on YouTube, I think, by wonderful Ali. So thank you all for coming, and I think we'll end there. Any last comments?
I definitely second that. You did an amazing job, and it was so impactful. And I really thank you for, like Jessica was saying, setting the framework was amazing to really help us understand. So really leading us from the inception of the issue all the way to the current state. So thank you again, and we really are so thankful to have you. So yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. As I mentioned, it's always a pleasure for me to share this topic. I am passionate about it, and it's important that the external community, people outside the Nile Basin know what the proper story is, because things right now are skewed in the favor of the historical narrative, and that's not helping the situation. So it's always a pleasure for me to come and share the story. And thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. And I'm glad to see it actually resonated with you, and I really do hope you got something out of this. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.